Hello, and welcome back to yet another discussion on fall damage in Elden Ring. I decided to make a follow-up video because I got a lot of questions and discovered some new things after the incredible response to my first episode. What's up with stamina loss? What's the deal with walking off ledges and double jumping? And is landing safely by a Spirit Spring actually inconsistent? All that and more in today's video. Once again, I'm not going to show any boss fights or talk about lore, so this is designed to be as spoiler-free as possible. But unlike the first video, I am going to have to show a couple later game areas a bit more. I'll do my best not to spoil the context too much, but we'll be stepping outside of Limgrave and into Caelid and Siofra for a few demonstrations. If you haven't watched the first video yet, definitely go back to that because this is an addendum that won't make much sense as a starting place. And if you're just looking for the most concise explanation of fall damage possible, I also created this wiki page, and you'll find its link in the video description below. First order of business here is stamina. You might have noticed that you sometimes lose stamina from falls, but I kinda glossed over this and simply mentioned that it doesn't relate to fall damage or survivability. I wanted to throw that out there because I know a lot of players suspected that fall damage was perhaps spilling over from stamina loss, like the two things were chained together in some way. This is not the case, but it probably didn't help that I didn't provide further clarification. How it works is that for falls greater than 4 meters in height, you'll lose exactly 25 stamina. And for falls greater than 8 meters, you'll lose 50 stamina. And of course your stamina doesn't drain when you're not in combat, so that's why it often doesn't happen at all. That's pretty much all there is to it. It's a much simpler system that doesn't scale in any way with your stats, nor is it affected by your equip load. There are also fixed breakpoints in the sense that falling from slightly under 8 meters still only removes 25 stamina. It'll suddenly jump from 25 to 50 once you're over 8 meters. Also, it might be worth noting that fall damage negation items like the Cat Talisman don't prevent stamina loss. Not that losing a bit of stamina from a fall is much of a concern in the first place. Just as a quick aside, finding a good place to test this was surprisingly difficult. You'd think that it would be as easy as aggroing a slime or a dog somewhere, and then just hopping up to a nearby ledge where they can't reach you. But I was surprised to see just how tricky it can be to have the game remain in combat. A lot of enemies will quickly de-aggro even if you don't make any effort to get away from them.
Stop, don't come back.
Thankfully, this axe-wielding Misbegotten was able to retain his focus. Spirit Springs are probably what I received the most messages about. Instead of using them to jump upwards, you can also use them to safely fall long distances by jumping down to them with Torrent and landing near them. I talked about how some of them have different safe landing zones, making certain ones a lot more dangerous than others. This one's on me for using the worst possible clip to convey this issue, as a lot of viewers pointed out that I was granted a safe landing buff mid-air before I jumped away in this clip, which is what they believed allowed me to land so far away. And the implication is that I just never got close enough to the one in Caelid to get that buff. After further testing, I feel somewhat vindicated to report that I was actually kind of right about this, but it's still my bad for not taking as close of a look as I should have to prevent confusion. So when you jump down towards the Spirit Spring, there is a safe landing buff that's granted mid-air, usually signified by a windy effect that surrounds the player. And the area from which you can obtain it should be like an invisible cylinder that's much wider than the visible part of the Spirit Spring. But a lot of people were saying that once you're granted the safe landing buff, that you can land anywhere you want. This isn't true. We can jump back out after seeing that we received the effect, and still die. So if this effect doesn't let us land anywhere, what does the safe landing buff actually do? What it appears to do is give us a safe landing anywhere inside the same invisible cylinder that grants the effect in the first place. This means that while you can't jump further away and remain safe, you also don't have to land on the ground directly next to the base of the Spirit Spring either. It extends above and below the Spirit Spring, so you have the freedom to land wherever you want, height-wise, within this space. I'd like to show another demonstration that doesn't involve me jumping directly over the Seaside Ruin Spirit Spring before double jumping away. This is what happens. We can also check the one over by the first step, and we'll once again find that we can stay really far away from it and still get the safe landing. Every time someone thought they were able to land further away from a Spirit Spring because of the safe landing buff, the reality is that if they dropped from directly above where they landed, that they would have also survived. They never had to get closer in the first place. And with some further testing, I found that this applies to basically every spirit spring in the game, usually allowing you to never have to get closer than roughly 13 meters from its core. Some of them still seem to vary a little bit, as I don't think most are as absurdly generous as the one by the first step. This might surprise you to see this, but this is actually possible there. But nonetheless, despite some potential variance among the normal spirit springs, you can typically land up to around this far from them almost every single time and be just fine. So the question remains, are there any that are significantly more dangerous than the rest? Let's rewatch the clip from Caelid. As we can see, yeah, there was a massive discrepancy there. For those who thought it was all about getting the safe landing buff from needing to jump directly over it first, I can do exactly that, jump back out, and also die. The interesting new bit of information I have here is that this was only happening with 6 specific spirit springs. All 3 from Caelid, and all 3 underground. Patch 1.03 actually fixed all of the ones from Caelid. So the good news is that these are no longer finicky, and you can now land pretty far from them too. But it seems they forgot about the underground ones, so your aiming will still have to be more precise for just the 3 found across Crusafer and Deeproot. If this changes with a future patch, I'll make note of it in a pinned comment below. Something you can do to test the width of an area that grants a safe landing buff is to simply jump around on the ground near a spirit spring. You'll get that heavy landing effect if it's in the safe zone. There was some speculation that perhaps some of the invisible cylinders that grant you the safe landing were made thinner than others depending on how close they were to a cliff's wall. But that doesn't seem to be a problem or a consideration for most. There are multiple places where you can find the safe landing effect on top of the cliffs above them, so having them clip through the geometry is common and not really a big deal. What's interesting is that the spirit springs underground, and the pre-patch ones from Caelid, don't apply this heavy landing effect unless you land very directly on top of them. I think the implication here is that their safe landing zones are one-to-one with the area that grants you the higher jump, and the developers clearly agreed this was an issue, having fixed all of the ones in Caelid. That's not to say that there aren't some other issues that can happen with spirit springs. If you clip the side of a ledge but continue falling, or perhaps hit a sloped surface on the way down, you can use up the safe landing buff that you were given, which can result in death. Though even when this happens, it is possible to be granted a second buff while falling and avoid any problems. But the circumstances under which that will or won't happen basically comes down to luck, so try not to brush up against the side of any ledges on your way down. In the previous video, I also talked about how falling for roughly 20 meters is the point at which the ability to double jump is taken away. But I was surprised to learn that so many people thought this had to do with walking off ledges instead of jumping off of them. There's a lot of players who believe that doing a mid-air jump with Torrent is only possible in the first place if you do an initial jump. And now I know why this is something that is so commonly observed. It appears to be an incredibly pervasive and consistent glitch. Depending on the class of weapon you're wielding while you're on horseback, yeah, you actually do have to jump off a ledge first in order to double jump. This applies to over a third of all weapon classes in the game, so it's not even remotely rare, and you can see why a huge chunk of the player base thinks this is normal. But considering how double jumping works just fine for every other weapon, and also while you're barehanded, it's safe to assume this is the intended default. So, is this really a glitch? It's kind of unfathomable that something so pervasive would be overlooked, and it basically applies to all of the heavier weapon classes. Now that might seem like an intentional grouping at first, but this starts to fall apart when you consider that regular spears are affected, while great shields aren't. If weapon weight was the concept behind this, you'd expect equip load to be invoked in some way. Plus, while there's almost some logic to the idea that carrying a heavier weapon would make double jumping harder, it makes less sense that doing another jump first is what would fix that. Like jumping more would be the solution for jumping being too difficult? Yeah, I'm gonna say there's no way this was intentional. So despite the grouping of weapons almost looking like it has a purposeful theme, what I think we're really looking at here is an issue with the player's animation. You'll notice that most of these weapon classes involve holding your weapon over your shoulder, while this is not the case for the unaffected weapons. Now, there are some weapons like spears that don't go over your shoulder and still have this problem, so I'm not suggesting that the specific shoulder pose is the only one that's broken, but nonetheless, I suspect that there's an issue with how the weapons are grouped into different poses, and perhaps not all of the animations were properly flagged for the ability to double jump. Anyways, this is all to say that my original observation about losing double jump after falling a certain distance should still be correct. That remains unchanged regardless if you have to do that initial jump. And once again, if this is ever fixed, I'll mention that in a pinned comment below. Something I didn't cover in the previous video was Elden Ring's mechanic for attacking by ledges. It's a safety feature where attack animations that cause you to step forward are held in place when you're standing on higher ledges. This was first introduced in Sekiro, and it's nice to see that they've decided to keep it. This is sometimes suggested as a mechanic that you can use to test the survivability of falls, but it's really not the greatest or most consistent tool for this, and I would recommend using rainbow stones instead. Reading up on some discussion about this, I see a lot of people defending this technique, saying that the rainbow stones aren't perfect either, and my last video did show an example of how those can fail, but trust me when I say that they're still a much better tool for determining fall lethality than swinging your weapon by a ledge. The game doesn't seem to be aware of the distance of every given fall out from a ledge, so this just seems to be an innate and arbitrary feature of certain geometry, likely handpicked by the developers every time they had a ledge with a somewhat significant drop next to it. There are places where it not only protects you from survivable falls, but it can even protect you from a lot of falls that wouldn't even cause damage. It seems to be a lot more common on clearly defined edges built with 90-degree angles, but you can also find some imperfect surfaces that it works just fine on as well. But sloped surfaces that aren't close enough to a 90-degree angle might not be included sometimes, as well as some really thin ledges like railings. This also doesn't work on elevators, so it's likely that anything that's considered unstable ground might not be included here either. And even with all of these caveats in mind, you can find some places where you'd expect it to work, and it might not be implemented there anyways. It's also worth bearing in mind that not every attack is covered. While I haven't yet created a comprehensive list, which is something I'll probably add to the wiki later, a lot of special attacks from Ashes of War will violate this new mechanic and send you over the edge anyways. And one example I've found so far of something that isn't a special attack, the left-handed thrust of torches also isn't protected. So yeah, this is a very helpful mechanic that's sure to prevent a lot of deaths, but the sort of conventional wisdom going around, that you can use it to inform you of fall lethality, isn't quite what it's made out to be. But despite some inconsistencies, it is pretty generous overall, and it sometimes works in some pretty surprising locations. I should also mention some of the exploits that break the rules of fall damage, but rather than do a deep dive here, I'm just going to do a quick overview. More glitches will probably be discovered later on, and we might learn more about how these glitches work in the future. So for the time being, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the weird stuff if you were wondering about it. There's a really cool glitch being used in speedruns that allows you to awkwardly teleport around, which is referred to as zipping. I was first made aware of this from watching some Distortion 2 speedruns, but if you'd like to know more, I highly recommend watching this video by Daravae, which I've linked below. There are some interesting quirks to it. In this clip sent to me by Daravae, he falls from a very high distance and manages to survive. At first I thought this had to do with the lack of a falling animation, as you'll notice the character is never posed as if they're falling, and they also don't perform a landing animation when hitting the ground. However, I have to thank DragonMZ on Twitter for informing me that there's actually a different reason, which ties back to the fall damage mechanics in an interesting way. Our current understanding is that the reason this is survivable is because where the character landed was higher up than the patch of ground that they zipped away from. So despite seeing the character drop out of the sky, the game is still comparing where we land compared to the ground we last touched. And because it's not 20 meters lower, you're able to survive. This is why zipping back down to somewhere lower enough results in death. But that's not to say that there aren't other instances where a fall animation not occurring probably is the cause of preventing death. Or at least something here is confusing the fall damage system, as riposting an enemy or getting grabbed while falling off a ledge also allows you to survive some lethal falls. Please let me know if any other weird fall glitches, or even stuff of tangential interest pops up. I know there's been some funny stuff like dropping onto elevators from higher up to trigger their movement and unlocking shortcuts early that way. Not that you're really breaking fall damage mechanics when you're doing something like that or a fall quit out, but it's still fun to see examples of players falling lethal distances with some kind of purpose in mind. In my last video, I talked about how there are places where you can survive much further falls than usual because fall damage is scripted to be disabled when landing in the right location. I mentioned that attacking while falling was a glitch that confused this and caused you to die, but it turns out that wasn't the only way to confuse it. Jumping off of the breakaway platforms was also something else that made them fail, so bear in mind that there were probably some other sources of failure that didn't get mentioned. That being said, attacking while falling and jumping while falling were both fixed in patch 1.03, so these spots are a lot less buggy now and should behave a lot better. Also, bear in mind that you should be fine as long as you land on the right patch of ground. I'm going to avoid showing some later areas, but I'll just say that if you fall from even higher than expected, or don't drop from the part of the floor that breaks away, you'll survive as long as you land in the same place that you're supposed to. Some kill boxes were also fixed. This pit in the Impaler's Catacombs is no longer survivable, so they corrected some of the locations where the death cam got triggered while the player survived. They haven't found and fixed all of the locations where this is possible, and they probably never will. They just fixed some of the more popular and egregious ones. However, in the process of doing so, they made a pretty big mistake in adding a kill box to this spot in Caelid. It made it impossible to get some items down there, but this was quickly corrected in patch 1.03.2. So there was a little under a 2-week window here where you might have experienced a really unfortunate kill box, but thankfully that's back to normal. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. I got a lot of comments expressing surprise at the half-hour length for a video about fall damage, but as it turns out, even that wasn't enough. I hope everyone's been enjoying the game, and I look forward to future dissections, as there'll be a lot more to explore besides fall damage. But if there were any lingering doubts or confusion on fall damage, I would like to quickly mention how a lot of the stuff I talked about has since been data mined or confirmed. Kingbore helped with identifying how some of the calculations worked, and even provided a screenshot of the code that specifies how a 20-meter fall is lethal. TarnishedSpreadsheet also looked over how it works, and created a working fall damage calculator in Google Docs, and I've included a link to it below. As long as you correctly identify your stats in these 3 fields, you can either input a distance fallen to see how much the damage would be, or you can input the actual amount of damage taken to see how high a fall was. Again, this is all being calculated in the exact same way the game does it. If you'd like to support this channel, please consider doing all the things on YouTube that help. Or you can also become a patron, and there's a link for that below as well. Thanks again.